Chapter 6. Falling in Love Again and Again. During World War I, Pablo found some new friends in Paris. One of them was a poet and playwright named Jean Cocteau. He introduced Pablo to a music composer. The two of them convinced Pablo to design a set and costumes for a ballet to be performed in Rome. It was about a circus and was called Parade. Pablo had never even seen a ballet before. He traveled to Rome to work on it. When it was finally performed, Parade bombed. It was too different for most people. The costumes were wild. So were the sets. And the music. And the dancing. While in Rome, Pablo became fascinated with ancient Greek and Roman art. He also became fascinated with beautiful Olga Koklova, one of the dancers in the ballet. He married her a year later. Back in Paris, Olga introduced Pablo to high society. They went to formal balls and to fancy resorts. For someone like Pablo, who had always cared so much about the poor, this was quite a switch. Olga was a snob. She kept Picasso away from old friends, and Pablo went along with it. He didn't need to work anymore. He was already rich. Yet that didn't mean he stopped working. Once again, he just changed direction. After the war, Pablo did far less with Cubism and collage. He went back to painting in more traditional ways. After all his experimenting, Pablo had found another way to surprise people, by not being the Picasso they expected. In 1921, Pablo and Olga had a son, Paulo. Pablo adored his new baby. He loved being a father, but it was a big change for him. Over and over, he painted mother and son in a new style. The forms were solid-looking, not jagged and broken as in his Cubist paintings. His painting, Three Women at the Spring, shows three figures in classical Greek-style clothing. They have very rounded forms and thick legs. Picasso said painting the legs brought back childhood memories of crawling under the dinner table and seeing his aunt's ankles. At the same time, he also painted three musicians in a very simplified Cubist style. But now, the shapes and colors were brighter. The figures looked like pieces in a jigsaw puzzle. Why would Picasso change suddenly from one style to another? He said he was simply using the style that best suited the subject. Then Pablo started painting things like centaurs and fauns. He had admired them in the ancient statues and art that he had seen in Italy. The Cubists thought Picasso was selling out. Picasso didn't care what other artists thought. He didn't want to be labeled. He was Picasso. By 1925, Picasso became interested in the Surrealist movement in art and literature. Surrealist painting was a way of expressing the unconscious mind. Picasso painted a world of dreams and nightmares. He took part in a show of surrealist art. On the side, Picasso was also writing poetry and doing book illustrations and etchings. He had enough energy for 10 people. Many of Picasso's surrealistic drawings and etchings were about bullfighting. He also made many images of the Minotaur, an imaginary creature that was half man and half bull. Some art critics think that Picasso liked to think of himself as a Minotaur. Making an etching. Etchings are drawings scrapped with a sharp tool on a metal plate. Prints are then made from the plate. Picasso also became interested in making sculpture. He had done some collage paintings of a guitar that used many 3D objects: nails, string, and the cloth. It was as if paintings like this were becoming sculptures. One day, Picasso met a metalworker and sculptor in Paris. His name was Julio Gonzalez. He was Spanish too. Julio and Pablo became friends. They worked together on abstract sculptures using welded metal rods and wire. It was something completely new. Unfortunately, Pablo's marriage to Olga was falling apart. They were living on separate floors of their house. She hated his messy studio, and it was messy. Pablo said the mess inspired him. Olga was the problem. She asked for too much of me, he said, so he bought a grand house north of Paris to escape her. Picasso said his last months with Olga's were a nightmare. At his new place, Picasso set up a sculpture studio in the stables. He made big plaster heads and started doing sculpture made with odd materials. One sculpture, Head of a Woman, was made with Uzi colanders. Picasso met a young girl just as she was coming out of the subway in Paris. Her name was Marie Therese Walter. It was love at first sight. Immediately, Picasso began painting her. Years later, he and Marie Therese had a child together, a girl named Maya. Did they live happily ever after? No! Picasso met a photographer named Dora. He fell in love with her just a year after his daughter was born. Picasso seemed to enjoy having a very complicated love life. He was still seeing Marie Therese and still dealing with Olga, and now there was Dora. Picasso's muses, the women in his life. Women were attracted to Picasso, but he must have been difficult to live with. He had a temper and could be grumpy when his work wasn't going well. Of course, he was totally charming at other times. He loved women, but he was very self-centered and absorbed by his art. In his life, he had many girlfriends and wives and 4 children. They were important to him as models and as his greatest source of inspiration. We know what the women looked like because he drew and painted them all. They were all beautiful.